Greetings, I am Reverend Due McCormick, Head Minister of Enyuzan, Perfect Dragon Mountain, Shinganji, True Vow Temple, of the Nichiren Shu Sangha of the San Francisco Bay Area. In this presentation of 4 parts, it is my goal to cover those things about the life and teachings of the historical Shakyamuni Buddha that Nichiren Shu expects its clergy to know. I feel that this might also be of interest to dedicated lay practitioners, as well as those who are curious about Buddhism and would like to know more about its founder and the basic teachings and practices that he taught. I will note that material appearing in red rather than black is material that is either not covered or not covered in detail in the book History and Teachings of Nichiren Buddhism, published by the Nichiren Shu Text Editorial Committee. This is material that I personally feel is important for Nichiren Buddhist practitioners to be familiar with, especially clergy and lay teachers. Now let's begin the second of the 4 parts, the awakening of the Buddha. As noted in the third of the 8 phases of the Buddha's life, the Buddha was born to Queen Maya in the Lumbini garden. In this stele, she is portrayed as having the Buddha emerge painlessly from her right side while she holds on to a sal tree branch. His family name was Gautama, which can be translated as large ox or excellent cow. He was given the name Siddhartha, which means one who accomplishes his goal. This event was commemorated with an inscribed pillar by King Ashoka, who visited the site in the 20th year of his reign. The inscription on the pillar was uncovered in 1896. It says, 20 years after his coronation, King Beloved of the Gods visited this spot himself and worshipped because the Buddha Shakyamuni was born here. He caused both a stone enclosure and a stone pillar to be erected to show that the Blessed One was born here. He made the village of the Lumbini free from taxes and subject to pay only 1/8 of the produce as land revenue instead of the usual rate. 7 days after giving birth, Queen Maya passed away. From that time on, Mahaprajapati, Queen Maya's sister, would act as the new prince's mother. Perhaps the death of his real mother had a hand in the young prince's sensitivity to the problem of birth and death. In the temple of the Brahmins at the time of Siddhartha's birth was the highly respected sage and seer known as Ashita. When he saw the baby, he began to weep, thereby arousing great fear in the hearts of Siddhartha's parents. They asked him if there was any cause to fear for their son, and Ashita told them that he wept not for the baby but for himself. Ashita told them that he wept because their son would surely become a Buddha, but he himself was too old and would not live to hear the Buddha's teachings. He told them, if he grows up, he will be a wheel-turning king. If he becomes a renunciate, he will become a Buddha who awakens to the truth and saves the people of the world. The young prince Siddhartha grew up receiving all the privileges and advantages of his station. King Shuddhodana had 3 palaces built for him, one for each of the 3 seasons in northern India, and beautiful courtesans and brilliant teachers surrounded the young prince. He was educated in martial arts, Vedic religion, and all the sciences known at that time, along with his cousins, including the ever-jealous Devadatta. Above all, King Shuddhodana tried to keep Siddhartha occupied with the pleasures and duties of the life of a prince. He did not wish to see his one heir heading for the forests to live the life of a mendicant. Nevertheless, Prince Siddhartha consistently displayed a compassion for all around him and could often be found deep in contemplation. Seeing this, King Shuddhodana ensured that Prince Siddhartha was married at the age of 16 to the beautiful and charming Princess Yashodhara of the nearby kingdom of the Koliyas. It was not too long before King Shuddhodana was presented with a grandson, Rahula, whose name means troublesome or fetter. The king hoped that Yashodhara and Rahula would be enough to keep Siddhartha in the palace. Siddhartha, however, could see nothing of any lasting value in the secular life of a ruler. Despite King Shuddhodana's efforts to shield Siddhartha from the harsh realities of life, the prince was painfully aware of the limits of life's pleasures and rewards. His realization of the inevitable fate of all mankind is related in the story of the 4 sightings. The story goes that Siddhartha wished to leave the confines of the palace and tour his kingdom by chariot. King Shuddhodana agreed, but he made sure that the route taken by the prince was cleared of any disturbing sights. The route to be taken would avoid any areas of poverty and destitution. All beggars, the elderly, and the sick were cleared out. The route would also be swept and hung with garlands of flowers. After all the preparations were completed, the prince was permitted to ride out of the palace grounds. The gods, however, foiled King Shuddhadana's plan by conjuring up the vision of a senile old man, bent and wrinkled by the ravages of time, the sight of which deeply disturbed Siddhartha. The prince asked his charioteer if this man was unique, or if all people were destined to become old. The charioteer explained aging to the prince and said, "This comes to us all." Prince Siddhartha made more excursions in the palace grounds, and each time his father tried to screen all disturbing sights from the route chosen. The gods, however, saw to it that the prince was exposed to all of life's suffering. The next vision was of a man laid waste by sickness. After that, it was a corpse surrounded by grieving friends and family. Each time his charioteer explained, "This comes to us all." The last vision was of a wandering mendicant. The charioteer explained that this was a man who had renounced the life of a householder in order to find peace and seek for the answers to life's suffering. Siddhartha knew then that this was the path that he was meant to follow. What good was palace life if it offered no security from old age, sickness, and death? Siddhartha decided that if he were destined to be a conqueror, he would not be a mere conqueror of kingdoms. Rather, his victory would be over suffering itself. It would be a victory for all people. One night, after an especially lavish party, Siddhartha saw all of his courtesans sprawling about the royal apartments. In the darkness, it seemed to him as though he were seeing piles of corpses strewn about. What had been seductive and sensuous was now gross and repulsive. That night, he decided to leave the palace and become a monk. After looking in on his sleeping wife and son one last time, he took his horse and rode out of the palace and into the forest with Chandaka, one of his retainers. There he cut off his hair and traded his court clothes for the humble dress of a mendicant. He then sent Chandaka back with his horse and a message for his family. He would not return until he had conquered old age, sickness, and death. According to the Account of Travels Sutra, the Buddha told his last disciple, Subhadra, "In the 29th year of my life, I renounced family life to seek the path of religion." In other words, the good path. "O Subhadra, it has been already 50 years now since I realized enlightenment. I have practiced morality, concentration, and wisdom, and I have been in solitary thought and seclusion. Now I am explaining to you the essentials of my teaching. There is no saintly realization through anything else but this practice." Note that Nichiren believed that Siddhartha left the palace at age 19, according to the record of wonders in the Book of Jo and the treatise on the great perfection of wisdom attributed to Nagarjuna. After leaving the palace life, Siddhartha practiced with two great masters of yogic meditation. The first was Arada Kalama, who had attained a state wherein one experiences freedom from the material world in the sphere of nothingness. Siddhartha rapidly achieved this state as well under Arada Kalama's instruction. It was not what he was hoping for. He then practiced with Udraka Ramaputra, who was able to enter into the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. This was also a disappointment for Siddhartha. Siddhartha saw that altered states of consciousness by themselves could not change one's life or provide any meaningful answers to life's problems. In both cases, his former teachers asked him to assist them in teaching their disciples, but both times Siddhartha turned them down and continued on his search for true liberation from birth and death. Siddhartha then joined a band of 5 ascetics and lived a very austere and reclusive life for 6 years near the village of Uravilva and Magadha. The 5 ascetics were by some accounts retainers sent by King Shuddhadana to watch over Siddhartha, who subsequently became sincere ascetics. Siddhartha hoped that a life of self-denial and severe discipline, as opposed to self-torture, would give him the clarity he needed to find an answer. After 6 years, however, his body was so weakened from fasting that he was close to death but still no closer to his goal. In fact, he passed out by the side of the Naranjana River while trying to get some water. A village woman named Sujata, who was stirred by compassion for him and nursed him back to health with rice gruel, saved him from death. Learning of this, the 5 ascetics were disappointed in this seeming lapse. How could he let himself be ministered to like that by a woman? With these thoughts, the 5 ascetics left for the deer park at Varanasi. In the meantime, Siddhartha realized that self-denial is as much of a hindrance to achieving enlightenment as self-indulgence. He determined to follow a middle way. Note that Nichiren and his East Asian contemporaries believed that Siddhartha spent 12 years practicing asceticism on Mount Dandaloka, so that according to East Asian ways of counting, he attained awakening at the age of 30. In most accounts accepted today, he left home at 29, practiced yoga and asceticism for 6 years, and attained awakening at 35. Now the time had come for Siddhartha to realize his ultimate aim. He thought back to a day in his youth when he sat beneath a rose apple tree in a state of calm abiding and clear awareness. He decided to again sit beneath a tree and reflect upon life in such a state of calm, centered awareness. After regaining his health, he went to the base of a pipala, or asvatha, the sacred fig tree that would thereafter be known as the Bodhi tree, near the town of Gaya. He sat upon a mat made of grass and made the following vow: "Let only my skin, sinews, and bones remain, and let the flesh and blood in my body dry up, but not until I attain supreme enlightenment will I give up this seat of meditation." This may sound like an extreme attitude to take, but it was not his intention to return to asceticism or self-torture. Rather, it was an expression of his single-minded dedication to achieving his goal. Now, this aroused the ire of Mara, the devil of the sixth heaven, whose name means stealer of life. In Buddhism, the devil of the sixth heaven is a kind of cosmic prison warden who keeps all sentient beings trapped in the cycle of birth and death. He ensures that they are constantly transmigrating through all types of existence from hellish to heavenly, always in pursuit of their desires. Mara is the stealer of life because it is his machinations that rob people of their life's true purpose, which is to achieve liberation. Mara was very concerned that Siddhartha was on the verge of liberation from his realm. As Siddhartha took up his meditation beneath the Bodhi tree, Mara summoned his daughters and his demonic armies to prevent Siddhartha from attaining enlightenment. According to the account given in the Sutta Nipata, the 10 armies of Mara were sensual pleasures, discontent, hunger and thirst, craving, dullness and drowsiness, cowardice, debilitating doubt, denigration and pride, gains, praise, and honor, extolling oneself and disparaging others. Siddhartha was unmoved. Even when the demons shot arrows or threw boulders or balls of flame at him, he remained still and the missiles turned into flowers floating harmlessly to the ground. As a last resort, Mara himself appeared and challenged Siddhartha, saying, "What gives you the right to presume that you can leave my realm of desire?" Siddhartha's reply was to place one hand upon the ground, thus calling the earth itself to witness that there was nowhere Siddhartha had not sacrificed himself in previous lifetimes for the sake of enlightenment for all sentient beings. Mara could do no more, and so fled with his army. Siddhartha's compassion and dedication had enabled him to subjugate Mara and his demons. Now that all of the distractions, doubts, and unconscious inhibitions symbolized by the demons were cleared away, Siddhartha was able to enter 4 increasingly refined states of meditative absorption, culminating in one-pointedness of mind and equanimity. With a calm and focused mind, he was able to contemplate the true nature of all phenomena and gain greater and greater insight into the human condition, beginning with his own life. In the first watch of the night, he recollected all of the events in all of his previous lives and reviewed all of the causes and conditions that had enabled him to arrive at the Bodhi tree. In the second watch of the night, he attained the divine eye, which meant that his awareness took in the lives of all sentient beings, and he saw how their lives were also governed by the causes and conditions that they themselves had set in motion. In the third watch of the night, he contemplated dependent origination, whereby all things come into existence and sentient beings forge their own destiny. He saw that all sentient beings suffering within the cycle of birth and death are trapped there because of the ignorant pursuit of selfish desires. Siddhartha realized that all suffering was due to a misapprehension of the nature of reality. As the night came to an end and the morning star rose into the dawn sky, Siddhartha awakened to the true nature of life. From that point on, he was known as Shakyamuni Buddha. Note that in the Buddha's time, the Brahmins claimed that the knowledge needed for liberation was knowledge of the Rig Veda, Samaveda, and Yajurveda. But for the Buddha, true knowledge came from what he realized during his meditation under the Bodhi tree. Knowledge from his past life recall, knowledge from the divine eye that surveys all existence, and the knowledge of dependent origination and deliverance from all defilement and delusion. According to the account in the great chapter of the Theravadan Vinaya, after a week of sitting blissfully under the Bodhi tree upon attaining Buddhahood, the Buddha contemplated the 12-fold chain of dependent origination during the 3 watches of the night, backwards and forwards. Later, the Buddha would teach the general principle of dependent origination as follows. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. Dependent origination also implies the law of karma or causality in terms of intentional actions. Karma means action, of thought, word, and deed, and their results in present and future lives. Our fate is not determined by our heredity, or by the gods, or by some impersonal fate, but by our actions, the causes, wholesome or unwholesome, that we set in motion. Here is how the Buddha taught the law of cause and effect in the Sutta Nipata. One is not a Brahmin by birth, nor by birth a non-Brahmin. By action one becomes a Brahmin. By action one becomes a non-Brahmin. One becomes a farmer by action. By action one becomes a craftsman. One becomes a merchant by action. By action one becomes a servant. One becomes a thief by action. By action one becomes a soldier. One becomes a priest by action. By action one becomes a king. So that is how the wise see action as it really is. Seers of dependent origination, skilled in action and its result. His most detailed analysis of dependent origination is taught in terms of the 12-fold chain of dependent origination. The 12-fold chain of dependent origination is the foundation upon which the Buddha's teachings rest, and so deserves careful study. Even the Lotus Sutra contains the formula of the 12-fold chain as taught in Chapter 7 by Great Universal Wisdom Excellence Buddha. He thoroughly explained the teaching of the 12-fold chain of dependent origination, namely that ignorance conditions volitional formations. In a traditional understanding, ignorance and volitional formations refer to past causes inherited from one's past life or lives. The cycle begins with ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. Due to ignorance, one is disposed to perform acts of thought, word, and deed based upon the most selfish and short-sighted of motives. These are the volitional formations. These actions are also called karma, intentional activity, motivated by ignorance. The next 5 links of the chain spell out the consequences of past karma in terms of one's present life. They are the present effects of past causes. The first link is consciousness. Volitional formations condition consciousness. According to Buddhism, the kind of person that we are now has been determined by our own choices and the habits or dispositions that we have built up over many previous lives. These predispositions give rise to and condition our consciousness of the external world and the internal awareness of thoughts and feelings. Some might be misled into thinking that consciousness is a kind of self that transmigrates from one lifetime to another. The Buddha stated in no uncertain terms that consciousness is not a fixed entity that transmigrates, but is itself something that arises in accordance with conditions. Consciousness is more of a recurring pattern, like a wave, than a thing. In another discourse, the Buddha even says that the mutability and impermanence of consciousness is even more drastic than that of the body, and therefore one would be better off identifying the body as a self. Now, consciousness conditions name and form. Consciousness, in turn, gives rise to and is supported by the aggregates that make up name and form. Name and form, in this case, encompasses 4 of the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, and mental formations. Name is applied to feeling, perception, and mental formations, as well as to contact and attention. These 5 always accompany the 5th aggregate, consciousness, as supportive functions which are involved in the recognition or naming of experience. Form is constituted by the 4 great elements that are elsewhere listed as earth, air, fire, and water. These 4 elements do not simply refer to earth, air, fire, and water as we commonly relate to them. Rather, the 4 great elements are emblematic of our experience of the physical world: solidity, movement, temperature, and cohesion, respectively. Name and form conditions the 6th sense basis. Upon birth, the psychophysical personality begins to utilize the 6th sense basis, consisting of sight, sound, touch, taste, smell, and cognition. These 6 senses bring one into contact with the world. They are sometimes called the 6 entrances, because through them the world enters into our awareness. The 6 sense bases condition contact. Bodily or even mental contact with thoughts and feelings conditions feeling. Feelings based on contact naturally arise, whether pleasant, unpleasant, or indeterminate. Again, these last 5 links describe what one experiences in the present life. They are all givens that are the fruits of one's own actions. The next 3 links describe one's present actions in relation to circumstances that one experiences. They are the present causes that will have future effects. Feeling conditions craving. The first of the present causes is the craving that arises based upon feeling, as one wishes to experience only pleasant feelings while avoiding the unpleasant at all costs. Craving conditions clinging. This craving leads to clinging to particular things, people, ideas, and circumstances. Clinging conditions becoming. This results in becoming, the constant struggle for identity and happiness that characterizes the day-to-day life of most people. The last 2 links of the chain explain the future effects of the present causes. In the Buddhist view, this constant struggle for a happy existence, or even for a peaceful annihilation, can never be achieved because life is characterized by the 3 marks of impermanence, suffering, and non-self. Becoming conditions birth. One's desperate strivings and unrequited desires can only lead to a future birth. Birth conditions aging, death, grief, sorrow, suffering, and lamentation. Birth inevitably leads to another round of old age and death, grief, lamentation, suffering, dejection, and despair. In short, the 12-fold chain of dependent origination shows that human life is the outcome of a vicious circle. The only escape is to abolish ignorance by recognizing the vicious circle for what it is. After showing how ignorance leads to suffering, the Buddha contemplated the ceasing of ignorance, which would then cause the ceasing of all that follows from it. The cessation of suffering follows from the cessation of ignorance. Since we are Nichiren Buddhists, let's look at how the O-Daimoku, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, expresses the essential nature of Shakyamuni's Buddhahood in terms of 2 stories about the Buddha's encounters with a Vedic creator deity known as Brahma immediately after his awakening beneath the Bodhi tree. These 2 meetings express the elements of the phrase devotion to the teaching of the lotus flower of the wonderful Dharma. Upon arising from the Bodhi tree, the Buddha considered who he should revere as his teacher. He realized that it was no other than the Saddharma, the wonderful Dharma, which had been his teacher. He then paid reverence to the wonderful Dharma. In response, Brahma appeared and said, "The Buddhas of the past, the future Buddhas, and he who is the Buddha now, removing the sorrow of many, all have dwelt, will dwell, and dwell, deeply revering the wonderful Dharma. For the Buddhas, this is a natural law. Therefore, one desiring his own good, aspiring for spiritual greatness, should deeply revere the wonderful Dharma, recollecting the Buddha's teaching. Therefore, paying reverence to the wonderful Dharma, which is what Namu Myoho means, is clearly stated to be what all Buddhas do, as well as the way in which those who aspire to spiritual greatness should recollect the Dharma." On another occasion, the Buddha was hesitating to teach because he thought that other people would be unable to understand what he had realized. Brahma appeared once again to plead with him to teach the Dharma. The Buddha then saw that people were like lotus flowers at various stages of maturity, growing in a pond. Some people were like lotus flowers on the verge of rising up from the muddy water and coming into bloom. If the Buddha were to teach these people, they would attain awakening. Here we see the symbol of the renge, the lotus flower. Upon hearing Brahma's invitation, the Buddha, out of compassion for all beings, agreed to teach and provide the threads of discourse, or kyo, that would enable people to practice and attain awakening. These 2 stories dramatize the spirit of the historical Shakyamuni Buddha's life, his dedication to the wonderful Dharma that brought people's awakened qualities into bloom through his teachings and personal example. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo also expresses this spirit, though it expresses the eternal Shakyamuni Buddha revealing himself in the Lotus Sutra as well. With that, I bring the second part of this 4-part presentation of the life and teachings of the historical Shakyamuni Buddha to a close. I hope that this presentation was helpful and informative and will help to enrich your faith in and practice of Nichiren Buddhism.